Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chris Harrold. I'm the Head of Crop Nutrition Agronomy for the UK and Ireland for Yara. And today I'd like to talk to you about autumn crop nutrition for oilseed rape and winter cereals. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentations, and if you would like to place any of those in the chat throughout the presentation, please feel free to do so. If I don't get the time at the end to answer all those questions posed, what I tend to do is get back to you on an individual basis after the event, so please feel assured that we will get back to you on any of those questions after today. There are some CPD points available for today's webinar. There's one Enroso point and one basis point, and the codes for those are at the bottom of the screen. I will put those up again at the end of the presentation, just in case we have anybody joining us a bit later on today. So yes, if you want to take down those codes, and then you can submit those to basis and Enroso to claim those points. Okay, so what are the topics that we're going to cover today? Well, as I've mentioned, the title of the webinar is discussing autumn nutrition of oilseed rape and cereal crops, but I'd like to start off really just talking about the value of analysis. I think it's something that we obviously do when we're assessing our requirements for crop nutrition, but I think it's worth just spending a little bit of time focusing on that before going sort of straight into talking about particular crop nutrition approaches for this autumn. Then we'll talk about oilseed rape, crop nutrition, then winter cereals, and then I'll just finish off today talking a little bit about nutrient management planning and the use of our @Farm platform, which some of you may well already be familiar with. I won't spend a great deal of time on that today, but I will hopefully just give you a bit of an indication of what that platform can help you with when it's coming to nutrient management planning. And then, as I said, we'll have a question and answer time at the end. Okay. I just thought this was an interesting slide to put up to start today. This was something I was actually looking at for a previous presentation, where we'd been challenged, or we often do get challenged in agronomy, about why yields of crops have plateaued in more recent years. And when you look at this slide, this is just purely looking at wheat yields over the last, well, 150 years, but if we just look at the last 70 years, we can see those huge incremental increases in winter wheat yields as farming practices changed. We adopted the use of nitrogen fertilizers, for example, big advancements in the plant breeding and plant genetics, other technologies as well. There were grants available for draining land, liming land, etc. All of those elements that have gone into improving wheat yields over all those years. But if you do look at the last sort of 20 years, that yield does appear to have plateaued for various reasons. And one of those, I think, is that area around sort of looking at crop nutrition and maximising that, because clearly plant breeders, for example, have continued to invest in plant genetics over that time. That hasn't stopped, and we know from the recommended list that wheat yields are increasing from year to year with the introduction of new varieties. So I think there are various elements as to why those yields have plateaued, but the other reason for showing this slide really is perhaps more to do with the bit at the bottom when we look at the anomalies. And I think it's quite stark. We've had anomalies in yields over the years for a long time. I'm a bit young to probably remember what actually happened in 1976, but I think it was a very dry year. I can just remember what happened in 1984 when it was an exceptionally high yielding year. But the point I'm trying to make is, if you look to the right of the slide in the last sort of 10, 12 years, how those anomalies seem to be more frequent. Yes, we've had some high yielding years in 2015 and 2019, but you can see some particularly poor yielding years in 2012 and 2020. Now, some of that's clearly down to the weather and perhaps impact that had on disease levels in those years. But the number or the frequency of those anomalies seems to be occurring more than it ever has. And that is clearly one of the factors or one of the challenges that we are having to face as an industry in how we overcome that and adapt to that, I suppose, going forward. But I just thought that was an interesting slide just to start the conversation off today. You'll have seen us use these images before, and you're probably all familiar with the Liebig's barrel. And I think that's probably one of the areas I think we could be critical of ourselves about when it comes to understanding why the yields of crops such as wheat have plateaued in recent times. We know that if one particular element or mineral is limiting, we could have got everything else right, but that limiting unit is potentially going to reduce the potential yield that we're going to get from the crop itself. And that brings me on to really this point about analysis and doing soil analysis on a regular basis. I know now that we're being encouraged to sample soils through the Sustainable Farming Incentive, for example, and the importance of testing now for organic matter, which we perhaps didn't do on a regular basis in the past. But it's important to do that and have a really good understanding of what the base is that you're working with, so that we can make the most of those inputs that we're making. And there's a lot of information again on our website about getting the best out of your soil analysis and doing the analysis in the right way. But the other point I wanted to make is, when we go out there, we take the time to do the sampling, or we use a contractor perhaps to do the sampling for us. And there is a cost to it, I appreciate that. But if you're going to go to the point of actually doing the sampling, why not make the most of that sample? Don't just do the basics, which would be the P, K, Mg, pH, and possibly now organic matter. There is so much more you could learn from expanding that soil analysis out to be broader spectrum, so that you could understand what's happening with the micronutrients as well as the macronutrients, understanding what your cation exchange capacity is of your soil, the CN ratio of the soil, the actual physical analysis of the soil. We probably take a very broad view of assessing what our soil type is, but actually having that physical analysis done could help us understand it in a much better way. The other area that you can do now with soil analysis is assess the actual biological activity of your soils, and you can do that from the same sample that you've sent in to do that sort of basic soil analysis that we've talked about already. So I would encourage you to consider that. You may not necessarily want to do a huge number of those particular samples, but if you're going to the extent of actually doing some soil sampling, it may be worth just doing or asking the lab to do some of the other tests that they can do with that sample, just to give you an idea of what's actually happening in your fields. pH, if you've joined any of my webinars this year before, you'll have heard me talk about pH in those. I do think it's an area that potentially we are not giving quite as much attention to as we perhaps used to do. Particularly this year, I was doing some soil sampling for a farm back in the summer post-harvest, and it was pH testing. and I was alarmed to see exactly how acidic some of the fields were on land that were not what you would typically class as being acidic soils. And basically, I think what we've had this year after such excess rainfall is the washing through of some of the calcium, and just finding that we've got more acidic soil, or certainly in the surface part of the field, more acidity than we perhaps thought we had. And we know that in those more acidic soils, the availability of the macronutrients can be affected. You know, if the pH drops to sort of 5.5, as I've illustrated there, you can see how particularly phosphorus, magnesium, potassium availability starts to drop away. Conversely, you may be on soils that have got higher pH, you know, pHs of 8, which is more typical, for example, where I'm based on the Yorkshire Wolds. That's not untypical at all to have a pH of 8. And in those situations, we can have issues with actually the availability of the micronutrients. But also you'll notice phosphorus as well. And that is something that we'll come on to a bit later on in the presentation today. So on that, when we look at pH, it's quite interesting to see over time how average soil pH levels have been declining. And if you took that line as it is, the red dotted line from, say, 1995 to early 2020s, there's about a 0.4 drop in 0.3, 0.4 drop in soil pH over that period of time. And it's a logarithmic scale, the pH scale, as you know. So 1 point of pH is 10 times more acidic than the last point. So if you go from pH of 7 down to 6, that's a 10-fold increase in acidity going from 7 down to 6. So I think, you know, this is something that I think we should pay more attention to now. I appreciate that lime inputs do cost, but the thing you must remember with lime applications is not to allocate the cost just to that single year that you make the application. I would argue that you would probably want to make that cost or spread that cost over the course of probably the rotation itself. Tissue analysis would be the next area that I would encourage people to consider doing if they aren't already. The ability of doing the leaf tissue analysis during the season, during the growing season, gives you that opportunity to correct anything that the analysis has flagged up. And sometimes we actually see what we call that hidden hunger. You don't actually see a deficiency in the field, but what the analysis shows up is there is actually a deficiency, and we'll show that in a moment. But I would certainly encourage people again to consider doing some leaf tissue analysis during the season, again, to help you sort of check where you are with the crop's health as you move through the growing cycle. And this is what I was really sort of alluding to with that hidden hunger gap. We know the visible deficiency symptoms that you get for a particular nutrient. Some of them are quite stark, but there is a period between that deficiency being visible to being an adequate nutrition, and we call that the hidden hunger or the hunger gap. And that is where your tissue analysis can really come into its own, when actually you think things look all right, but on analysis you find that actually there are some deficiencies that could benefit from correcting. And the final area of assessment that I think is worth considering, and is being done more and more now, I would suggest, is grain analysis. Now we know that grain analysis at harvest is not new for example, assessing specific weight, protein content, N to S ratios and things like that. They've been done for many years, but we're now actually seeing a lot of demand for grain analysis for phosphate and potash. And we know from recent research that there are critical levels for those elements within the grain. And when we know what the crop offtake is in yield, there's a lot more farms now that have that ability with yield monitoring on the combine, or they may also have weighbridge facilities nearby or on the farm. They can convert what the grain analysis is telling them into actually what they've taken off the field in the crop yield itself. And therefore, we can start to really make use of that data when we're planning our nutrient inputs for the coming season. And when you look at the winter wheat sort of uptake of those macro and secondary nutrients, we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of kilograms of nutrients that a higher yielding crop would take off or uptake over the course of the season. And the point I'm wanting to make here is if we know what the crop has actually utilised in that season, therefore it's taken those nutrients away from the field, clearly we need to make sure that we rebalance that offtake at some point through the rest of the growing rotation to replace that. So you can see that, as I say, tens, if not hundreds of kilograms for those macro or secondary nutrients. Equally as important, but clearly we're talking about much smaller quantities, are the micronutrients. Here we're just talking about tens or maybe hundreds of grams per hectare for things like boron, copper, manganese. But if you just sort of reflect back to the first slide I put up with the Liebig barrel, if any one of these nutrients may be lacking, then we could potentially be compromising yield and the ability of the crop to utilise all those other nutrients that we may well have been investing into the crop. Okay, so that was really just sort of set the scene, if you like, and a sort of suggestion to where you can make the most of any kind of analysis that you may be doing, or perhaps even just encourage you to consider some of those other options that you may not be doing or not widely be doing on the farm to help you formulate your nutrition plans for the coming season and hopefully improve yields and utilisation of the inputs that you are using. So now I'd just like to move on to talk about oilseed rape, autumn nutrition. We know that oilseed rape has had its challenges in recent years, and the number of farmers that are growing oilseed rape now has declined, and you can see that. The sort of national acreage of oilseed rape over the coming year is expected to be somewhere between 200 and 250,000 hectares, which is about a third of where it was at its peak in 2012, I think. And we know why. Flea beetle has been a real challenge since the removal of the seed treatments that we used to use. But also I think there are other challenges, weather challenges as well, during establishment of oilseed rape as well. Thankfully, I think this year, from what I've seen, certainly locally and talking to agronomists and farmers up and down the country, oilseed rape establishment has been more successful this year to date. There has been a very wide drilling window from late July through to, I would say, the middle of September. So there are crops at varying different growth stages this year, but all being well, so far, I think flea beetle, for example, has been a much less problematic pest than it has been in the past. So if we just sort of look about the key growth stages for oilseed rape, the key components of yield are the numbers of pods and clearly the number of seeds in those pods. And those are very strongly influenced by plant population. And we've done a lot of work over the years looking at plant populations, and certainly we've come back down with our plant populations, I would say, and the introduction of hybrid varieties has certainly helped us do that. We know the benefits of those smaller plant populations and the ability of the plant to branch out and set pods. But I think it will be very interesting this year, as I said, with that very wide period of establishment for oilseed rape. Those very, very early established crops are very forward, and it will be interesting to see how well those crops make it through the winter months and actually through to harvest next year. We know that oilseed rape prior to winter requires somewhere between 1,000 and 1,100 day degrees of heat accumulation to get that plant into a sufficient state for it to sort of successfully see it through the winter months. Any growth above that potentially would mean the plant is perhaps a little too advanced, and we know that those more advanced plants, they could adversely affect the ability to set flower buds and those side branches that we know can contribute to yield. So I suspect perhaps unusually this autumn we may find that some oilseed rape crops will have more growth regulators applied this year than they've perhaps had for some time. So we're talking about the key growth stage, and particularly here more about establishment really, prior to that leaf and floral initiation through the winter months. And some of the key nutrients that we'll talk about are things like magnesium, boron, molybdenum. But firstly, I just want to touch really a little bit about nitrogen and phosphorus. Some work that Yara did some years ago now, 10 years ago in fact, and you can tell that from the varieties that we've got in that that are probably no longer grown, where we were applying some seedbed fertilizer in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus. We got nearly a 35% increase in the number of established plants over and above where there was no seedbed fertilizer applied. I think that approach to oilseed rape establishment is well understood, and I suspect this year that most people will be happy with their oilseed rape establishment and will have used some form of seedbed nutrition, whether that was from a bag or liquid fertilizer, or quite likely an organic material as an alternative. For those later sown crops, as I mentioned, I know that oilseed rape in certain parts of the country were being established into the middle of September, and potentially are looking a little bit smaller. If there was a requirement for some phosphorus to promote some rooting, there is still time to do that, and that could come from a foliar application. What I'm showing you here is some work that was done in our Pocklington glasshouse with a foliar application of some phosphate through Magphos K. This was actually at the equivalent of 5 litres to the hectare. And you can see here the benefit it had on actual root promotion in this instance. So if you find yourself in a situation where you haven't perhaps been able to apply some seedbed fertilizer because it was a bit later established, then you could consider applying a foliar phosphate product like Yara Vita Magphos K at 3 to 5 litres to hectare at this sort of growth stage 14. You may well want to time it with, for example, a volunteer cereal herbicide if you haven't already done so. It's a little bit early yet in this autumn to show you any leaf tissue analysis from 2024 autumn, but this is what we received into the lab at Pocklington last autumn, 2023. And this is a data set of 80 samples. And you can see last year that there's quite a lot of very low or low results in that data set, and particularly things like boron and molybdenum, magnesium, phosphorus as well. So I think, again, the ability to do some tissue analysis will help you understand whether the crop would benefit from some foliar nutrition in the autumn. This is some data from the Yen project. I have to say this is actually looking at tissue analysis in the spring, but I really just have included it here to show you that the higher yielding crops in that project, this is basically showing you the top 5 versus the bottom 5 crops in the project over the years 2019 to 2022. All of those high yielding crops shown in the sort of pinky orange curve opposed to the blue one, all of them had a much higher concentration of those key elements throughout the spring growing season. So I think it's important to consider making sure that the crop has sufficient supply of those key nutrients through that growing period, and that includes the autumn, not just the spring. So there are 2 key reasons to consider using some autumn foliar nutrition this year. It provides those nutrients straight into the plant to maintain that crop growth and improve that winter hardiness, and you're loading the crop up with those nutrients ready for that spring growth as well. And we know that that can be advantageous as well, and help you get that crop going into the spring as well. So our product of choice at this point would be Yara Vita Brachytrol Pro, and we've had that product for a number of years, and this was some trial work done over a 6-year period. And you can see where we just applied in the autumn, we got a 0.21 tonne to the hectare yield increase. Where we applied autumn and spring at 2 litres to the hectare, it's 0.23. But actually our best result came from an application at 3 litres in the autumn and another 3 litres in the spring. And that's a very consistent set of data. And if we just put some figures on that based on valuing oilseed rape at £440 a tonne for next harvest, and the Brachytrol Pro at £5.60 a litre, the return on investment was just under 4 to 1 based on those yield results. So our recommendation would be to apply Brachytrol Pro this autumn from the 4 to 8 true leaf stage, and you don't need a great deal of extra yield to pay for that investment. Brachytrol Pro is very widely tank mixable, and you could mix it with your herbicides, for example, the propyzamide based products later on, or if you are just planning to go through with a fungicide for foamer or light leaf spot, you could be applying Brachytrol Pro at that timing as well. But as always, we would point you to the tank mix website for any specific tank mixes that you may be considering this autumn. So just a little bit of a summary there. If you are considering or haven't been able to put any seedbed fertilizer on, and you're wanting just to encourage a bit of extra rooting, then an application of Magphos K, perhaps with a volunteer cereal herbicide, may be beneficial. And then later on with your fungicide applications or propyzamide applications, we would recommend Brachytrol Pro at 3 litres to the hectare. Just a little word of caution there, not to be tempted to mix the 2 products together. They are quite different in their pH, in their formulations, which means they don't readily mix together as 2 products themselves. As individual products, they're very tank mixable with other crop protection inputs, but just don't be tempted to mix the 2 together. They want to be separate applications if you are intending doing that. Okay, so if I'll just move on now to winter cereal nutrition this autumn, similar sort of approach to what we've just taken with the oilseed rape, looking at those key growth stages and how yield is driven. Obviously, it's all about ear numbers and grains per ear and the size of those grains come next harvest. But really now we're talking about the foundation stage, that sort of pre-growth stage 30, getting that crop established through good rooting and tillering, and to achieve that optimum nutrient use efficiency that we want to maximise yield. Again, if I could just refer to the ADAS-YEM project, that does tend to highlight the benefit of those bigger biomass crops leading to bigger yields. You know, that larger, deeper roots system is better able to access nutrients and water, improving that nutrient use efficiency, particularly of nitrogen. And this all becomes even more vital for later sown crops, perhaps after root crops, or if you've had a delay to establishing the crop during the wetter periods of the autumn. So I just wanted to sort of just highlight really the growth stages that I'm focusing on here. Now, you'll all have seen these sort of growth cycle charts before, and we're really focusing at the start, that sort of root growth period at the start of the season. This looks a little complicated. I won't dwell on it for too long, but you can see where we've looked at in our trials, but also sort of studies of literature, the key timings for certain nutrients through the growing cycle. We know where a lot of them are, the nitrogen inputs, the sulfur inputs, for example. But what I'm focusing on here is some of the micronutrient inputs. When is it essential to get some of those nutrients into the crop? And really, I'm focusing here at that pre-winter establishment phase. And if you can just sort of focus on that red circle, we're talking about manganese and particularly also zinc as being important for that pre-winter period. So why am I sort of highlighting manganese and zinc? Well, they do play a key role in crop health throughout the growing season, but if we're just focusing now on that sort of pre-winter period, we know that manganese and zinc play a key role in the production of chlorophyll and therefore photosynthesis. But we know manganese also is important for healthy roots. It ensures high lignin content in the roots and therefore increasing the resistance to root infecting pathogens. But also zinc promotes auxin levels, and that can also help obviously optimize canopy development. If you have got issues with manganese, I wouldn't be delaying treating for that. We know that certain soil types, certain areas within particular fields tend to have issues with manganese deficiency. And I would imagine most of you on the call today will know where those problem areas are and will treat for manganese as a matter of course. We know that you know, once that biomass starts to fade away because of deficiency, we really can't get it back, and we don't want to be losing biomass or tillers at this stage in the season. And I know that's why a lot of people will favour manganese seed treatments, for example, as a starting point, and foliar applications in the autumn to top that up. We have Mantrap Pro, Yara Vita Mantrap Pro would be our product of choice. It's a suspension concentrate of manganese, but a very, very high loading of manganese per litre. And we know it gives you that long-lasting, sustained feeding effect as a product. Interestingly, some work done some years ago now, but it's still equally as relevant today, where we looked at Mantrap Pro applications before and after winter. And what we found was there was a benefit from applying autumn applications of Mantrap and then again in the spring over just relying on a spring application. That was a particularly low yielding crop, I have to say, but the benefits of the two applications was quite clear. Something perhaps not quite as commonly talked about in the autumn is zinc, but from the points I mentioned before about the benefits of zinc in improving the tolerance of the crop to winter weather, particularly frost, it is worth considering perhaps looking at zinc in the autumn as well as the manganese. And we have a product in our portfolio, Yara Amazinc, and as the name might suggest, that's actually a product that's a combination of manganese and zinc. So if you've got issues with manganese in the field and potentially the zinc, you've got a perfect product there for that autumn application. Very high concentration of both nutrients, and again, very widely tank mixable. So there's an option there if you've got concerns around zinc as well as the manganese to use Amazinc instead of just straight Mantrac. I said I'd come back to phosphorus. I've touched on it already, the importance of it for rooting in the oilseed rape piece that we did, but I just want to talk a little bit about it in winter cereals as well. I highlighted right at the start about the impact that soil pH can have on the availability of phosphorus, and the fact that once the soil gets to be acidic, the phosphorus gets locked up on the aluminium and iron. But on the flip side of that, if you've got more alkaline, higher pH soils, the phosphorus becomes attached to the calcium. So therefore, in both extremes, limits the availability of the phosphorus to the plant. So that can be an issue. Clearly, there is the ability to use lime or correct the pH if you're at the acidic end. It becomes a little bit more tricky when it comes to higher pH alkaline soils about phosphorus, but there are ways around dealing with that. There are certain products in our range, in the Yara range, that use a combination of phosphorus sources to help improve that availability of phosphorus before it gets locked up on the calcium. But clearly there's options to tailor your inputs of phosphorus on those higher pH soils to perhaps focus on applying it in the spring when the crop it requires more of that perhaps, and also when soils are warmer. As you can see there, also the soil temperature has an impact on the availability. If there is a serious requirement for phosphorus on those higher pH soils, then we can talk more about foliar application, and that's what I'll focus on shortly. Just using the Yen project again, you will see this is in the spring, this one, but you can see again those higher yielding crops in the project all showed a higher concentration of phosphorus in the leaves coming out of winter. And I think that's an area again that we should consider focusing on when we're trying to maximize yield. So if we are looking at a foliar application of phosphorus in our winter cereal crops to kind of overcome some of those issues around phosphorus availability from the soil, whether that is pH related, whether it's soil temperature related, then using a foliar application of a product like Yara Crop Boost can help sort of bypass those issues around the soil by directly applying that foliar phosphate to the leaf. Yara Crop Boost doesn't just have phosphate in it, it also has some potassium, magnesium and also some zinc, and we know that it's readily taken up by the plant and does have good tank mixability as well in the autumn. So we'll come on to some more details about that. But here's some work again looking at foliar applications of phosphate in the lab, and you can see this is actually winter barley, and you can see the benefit of the application in the lab gave us a 10% increase in fresh shoot weight, but also root weight as well. That application of Yara Crop Boost, as I've said, includes other elements, and we know that they can also have a benefit from including in the mix. And you can see here that the inclusion of the zinc, which I've already touched on prior, could also have those benefits about improving sort of winter crop hardiness. We have, of course, done some trial work looking at crop boost in the autumn. And you can see this work done a few years ago in 3 different trials. In one of the trials, we didn't have any response to that autumn application, but in the other 2 trials, the benefit over applying that crop boost in the autumn over the spring averaged out over the 3 trials at just under 0.2 of a tonne. So that was the advantage over applying it in the autumn over waiting until the spring. I haven't got the results back from any work this year, but this was our results from 2023, looking at autumn applications again of crop boost, this time in a crop of dorsum. And you can see again, there was a benefit over not applying it, but also over applying it in the spring. And another crop this time, X days. And again, you can see there that actually there was a clear benefit from applying the crop boost in the autumn over waiting to put it on in the spring. And that would be our recommendation, to consider applying 3 litres of Yara Vita crop boost in the autumn. It is tank mixable with a range of herbicides. So if you've still got sort of post-emergent herbicides to go on later on this autumn, or if you are considering putting a BYDV insecticide on when you're travelling through the crop, then it is tank mixable with those. But again, as always, if there's any particular mixes that you are interested in looking at, then have a look on the Tank Mix website, or you can put in a request for a particular tank mix if you can't find it on there. So just to sort of summarise, winter cereal, autumn nutrition, it's all about focusing on building that biomass above ground but also below ground. Don't delay those manganese applications if you're on deficient soils or where there's a potential to compromise the biomass. And Yara Vita Mantrac Pro or Yara Vita Amazinc would be good options in those situations. But if you're looking to really boost your rooting and early tillering to overcome any issues you may have with phosphate availability in the soil, then you could consider an application of Yara Vita Crop Boost this autumn. Again, caveat there at the bottom of the page, don't be tempted to mix Mantrac Pro or the Amazinc with the Crop Boost. Again, it's that difference in pH in their formulations that limits their ability to be tank mixed together. Okay, just the last few slides now in the presentation. As I mentioned at the start, I just wanted to touch briefly on nutrient management planning. As you're looking ahead to putting those plans together for next spring, there is a great platform in AppFarm that you could utilise. It's free to access, and there's a lot of functions within AppFarm that you may consider making use of. It utilises satellite technology, sensors, and if you have got N-Tester, that's where you would utilise the N-Tester through the AppFarm platform. And it's been designed to be a very simple one-stop shop, which is being improved and developed all the time. And it's certainly worth a look. And I'll put a link up to where you can go and find more information about AppFarm. There are various functions within it. And it's the nutrition plans that I'm going to focus on just in a second. But you can also use the platform for measuring and adjusting your nitrogen applications through things like the N-Tester. You can do variable rate applications of nitrogen as well. And also there's the ability to sort of monitor your field's progress throughout the season as well. But it's this bit at the beginning that I just want to spend a moment on, just highlighting to you as a tool that you may want to look a little bit more at ahead of you making your plans for next year. So how does the nutrition plan work in AppFarm? It's based on your entered field and crop parameters clearly, so there is a little bit of work to do. You have to put some of the information in there, of course, but providing these inputs, you can get an exact nutrient amount calculated for the crop through the whole crop cycle, and it will break it down to give you specific advice for each growth stage, so that you optimize the fertilizer and the influence of the nutrients you're putting on. You can also put your own soil values into AppFarm if you've got them, but if you don't, then it works on regional soil values. But again, the accuracy of these systems is always better if you can put more of your own data into them. So by providing that information, obviously you get an informative nutrient plan, but you also can then track your field soil fertility over time from one soil test to the next. You can add or modify products within the system as well, which allows you again to sort of fine-tune that plan as you go through the growing season. So that's the link, but we'll make sure that that's available to you. But again, if you search AppFarm on the Yara website, that will take you to more information about the platform and how it can help you with your nutrition planning. So thank you very much for joining today. I've just put my contact details up there at the end for you if you want to get in touch with me directly by email or by phone. Quite happy to take any calls or emails you may have. Again, I've just put up there the CPD points for today's webinar if you didn't catch them at the start. And I'll leave it there, but please, yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed that, but do get in touch with us if you think we can help you with any of your crop nutrition queries this autumn. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.